George starts the video letting everyone know that although he did tweet that he was going to go live, he decided that it was better to make this video in a more controlled setting where he could have a script and edit his words if he needed to, pointing out another hypocrisy because people have been criticizing Caiti, feeling like she did not need to write anything because anyone who's been assaulted will remember it, but no one criticizes George for writing down his statement. And I feel like it's even more pathetic that he gave himself the grace and control of being in a controlled setting and being able to take things back, where Caiti went live in both statements and was scrutinized for missaying some things and misplacing her words. I totally understand him not willing to go live for the first statement, but him going live for the second statement is completely cowardly. And I feel like if he is going to pick Caiti out as somebody who is incapable of thinking for themselves, it is only fair that he meets her on the same level as going live. But if you made it this far through the video, you know that my opinion on George is that he is a coward, which is what he has displayed in this situation, a cowardly behavior. George starts by talking about how they all got to the after party. He shows a few screenshots showing that him and a few other people are making plans on how to get Caiti and her friends passes to be able to go to the hotel. He shows those screenshots because Caiti said that her friend who was romantically involved with Dream was invited to his hotel for the second after party, and since her friend did not feel comfortable going alone, she decided to go with her friend as well as 3 other girls. The issue was that only 2 of the girls were content creators, and the hotel had the rule that only content creators can enter. So the screenshot George is currently showing is not proof that the girls were actively trying to go to the second party. It's proof that the Dream agreed to let the girls try to get in with her friends to go to the after party. These screenshots don't mean anything to me at all, because there's a difference between them having to go to the second after party because her friend wanted to be there with Dream versus them actively trying to go to the first after party. There is another screenshot of them trying to get to the first after party and Dream not wanting to go because he wasn't revealing his face at that time. It's a whole different thing. I'm going to bring it up later, but I'm telling you right now that you could clearly see a difference between Caiti actively trying to get something and Caiti trying to figure out how to get something because she wants to be there for her friend.
I mean, good time. Just something I actually want to point out before I continue with the rest of the story is the way that she phrases some things in her story. Instead of saying that her and the rest of her friends actually wants to come to the hotel to hang out with us, she said that one friend was invited by Dream, but she didn't want to go alone. So then they decided to go along with her because they were willing to go anywhere. I just think it's important to note already that the story is slightly different from the reality of it, and I'll be mentioning this a few more times throughout the rest of the story. You can see in these screenshots from the text at the time that they were all trying to come to the hotel, and it wasn't just oh, we're willing to follow her, essentially. They were all in the group chat and part of the discussion to go to the hotel.
George is showing a screenshot of somebody asking what game they're using. He shows this screenshot because Caiti claims that they were trying to push alcohol on them. This again means nothing to me because George for some reason loves to assume. There could be multiple reasons why they were asking for the name of this game. Let's apply some logic to this thought. If Caiti and her friends only planned on playing the drinking game at the second after party, they would have never asked for the name of the game to start with. It could have just been, or can we play the game we played before, and not them actually asking for the name of the game. Caiti and her friends asking them for the name of the game could mean that they wanted to play the game at a different time without George and his friends. This screenshot doesn't prove that they were not being pressured to drink. George is just showing that Caiti was asking for a drinking game app. This screenshot does not go to talk about anything that happened while they started playing the game or while they started drinking. George claims that Caiti is lying about her using her phone as a distraction from what he was doing to her and claiming that she was passing the phone around for everyone to play the game. This would obviously paint a different picture to what Caiti has said about her version of the event, but let's apply 2 brain cells to this thought. Let's pretend that everyone wanted to be an adult and brave and were interested in playing a game where someone of the opposite gender would touch them inappropriately to see who had the best focus when playing the game. My question would then be, did George stop touching Caiti when Caiti was no longer in charge of the phone? Because he did admit to touching her inappropriately without her consent when she had the phone because he wanted her to lose the round she was playing. However, after she was done playing, did he move his hands away from her body? Did he stop what he was doing? He did not. Okay, let's pretend that there was another scenario where Caiti was actually using her phone to protect herself by distracting herself from what was going on. My question is, was she passing the phone before or after he put his hands on her body? This does not make anything clear. It's just another evidence of George intentionally bringing up details to confuse people. Yes, it's clear that he had his hands on her body while she was playing the game. However, was this before or after the phone was being passed around and she did not have the game to herself? or did he put his hands on her after the game was no longer being passed around and Caiti was now free to focus on the game? I know he thought bringing this up would give him a bit of a benefit, but in my opinion, it makes things worse, because if he did not have his hands on her body to distract her from playing the game and she was playing the game, he swears he did not have his hand on her body for his own. Then he have his hands on her body because he felt entitled to it, ownership over it? There is absolutely zero reasons to have your hands on somebody's body in an intimate location without their consent, and since he claims to have zero reasons outside of his intentions, then there was no reason why he should have his hand on her body without her consent.
And during this, me and Caiti were at the far end of the couch and we were cuddling together. We had been cuddling for, I'd say, around an hour at this point, playing the game, talking, and just having fun. And for clarity, I had my hand around her waist above her clothes.
And then he said that she seemed happy about the situation and seems like she was having a good time, which is weird to me because he so far has not asked her if she feels comfortable about what he was doing to her. I know people are going to ask, why did she not say anything? Why did she not try to get his hand off her body? There is absolutely zero reasons why it should be her responsibility to take his hands out of their body. He wanted to keep his hands on her body, so it was his responsibility to ask her if she was okay with him touching her in that way. It is not her job to ask him to stop. It is his job to make sure that she feels comfortable. It is his job to make sure that he gets consent from her. He's the one pursuing the interaction ever since he first DM'd her at the first after party. He is the one that should be responsible with making sure that she wants to reciprocate any interactions that they've been having so far. And just to be clear, George is not a body language expert. He has known Caiti for less than 5 days. He does not know her long enough to know what her body language and mannerisms are, so he cannot use body language as an excuse for assuming consent for her. Trying to colorate laughing and being upbeat when drunk as a sign of giving consent is very irresponsible, because for some people, being giggly and upbeat is the most common reaction to alcohol. Both parties are willing to admit that Caiti was very drunk during all these interactions, and that shows that not only was she not capable of giving consent, he could not have been able to assume consent for her based on her body language due to the effect alcohol was having on her actions and mannerisms.
She wasn't being awkward at all. There was no sense of uncomfortability from her. She was laughing and playing with everyone. And yeah, I'm not really sure why she phrased it like this.
George then talks about how they've been cuddling for hours and how she was making it seem like he just put his hand under her clothes and then went for the top, and how he was actually taking his time to make sure that she was comfortable by slowly going up. I have an issue with this because Caiti is 18 years old and George is 26. Now he claims to not know her age, and this means, in my opinion, that George feels comfortable touching women under their clothes without verifying their age to make sure that they're adults who are able to give consent. Like I mentioned earlier, George is not proficient in reading body language, especially since he's known Caiti for less than 5 days and will not be able to know what her mannerisms mean. So he had no way to evidently know that he was successful in his conquest of making sure Caiti was comfortable while touching her without her consent. And to imagine that all this could have been avoided if he had just fucking asked for consent. And honestly, I am at the point that I'm starting to consider the fact that Caiti might have been drunk to the point that she was probably not able to give consent legally, because if she was already losing her balance while intoxicated, then Caiti is at the point where you try to make sure she's safe and accounted for, not trying to molest her into becoming a sexual partner for you.
There was more alcohol in the room and we were encouraged to drink some more as they offered the bottles to us. They said they would join us in drinking and insisted on drinking games. They had already been drinking before they arrived. They were drunk, and
according to the medium, what is important is capacity. Being incapacitated does not just mean being passed out from being drunk. It can also apply if someone is getting sick, unable to walk properly, and is acting out of character. George does not know Caiti enough to know what her character is, so he is not able to determine if Caiti is acting out of character. However, according to George and Caiti, she was already so drunk that she was losing her balance before they got to the second after party in Dream's room. So Caiti was no longer able to legally give consent to George. Even if he wants to talk about body language, Caiti was already at the point where she was no longer able to give consent, so he could not even have been able to get consent from her verbally or non-verbally just because of how intoxicated Caiti was. George claims to be cautious of consent, and to be cautious of consent, you have to be educated on what consent is. Time and time again, George has missed the mark on what consent is and who is able to give consent. George did not try to make sure his sexual partner was a legal adult by asking for her age or trying to figure out her age. So he does not understand how important it is to make sure that the person who is given consent is a person of the legal age of consent. George took away his partner's ability to say no by not verbally asking for consent. Although body language could be a way to determine if someone is given consent to sexual interactions, George was in the position where he could ask her for consent and get a verbal response, but he chose not to, showing that George is not educated on the appropriate time to look for nonverbal consent, such as body language, and the appropriate time to look for verbal consent, especially in situations where he is interacting with a stranger. George is not educated on who can give consent when alcohol is involved. Both George and Caiti have admitted that Caiti showed signs of being incapacitated, and people who are incapacitated can legally not give consent. So George was looking for consent in a party who had consumed alcohol over the legal limit required to be able to give consent. Although there is no number to determine what those limitations are, Caiti was showing signs such as not being able to maintain her balance, which is one of those signs of being over the limitation. George shows another sign of being uneducated on what consent means because George admitted to not wanting to ruin the mood by asking for consent. Being able to take no for an answer is a sign that you are educated on consent, and since George is not able to prove what the mood was for Caiti, who was too intoxicated to give consent and did not know George long enough for him to know her mannerism, the only mood George was able to provide or consider in this situation was his mood, and if both parties' moods cannot be accounted for, then consent cannot be given. George cannot identify the appropriate amount of intimacy reciprocated. If George is not able to identify the amount of intimacy consented to him, George will not be able to know when to stop if he has reached those boundaries consented to him. If George thinks touching someone in the private area is equivalent to that person playing games and fighting with him, then George cannot be trusted to be able to know the amount of intimacy reciprocated to him and to be reciprocated back to the person given consent. He talks about Ghost, the person Caiti shared a room with, and how Ghost claims that the girls had a good experience. I don't get how he's using that as a way to prove that everyone overall had a good experience, because what does that have to do with Caiti's experience? How is he going to tell Caiti that she had a good experience because another person in that room did, when Caiti is literally telling him that she did not have a good experience because of what he did to her without her consent? Claiming that he is not trying to use Ghost's experience to invalidate Caiti, while literally using Ghost's experience with Dream to invalidate Caiti's experience with him. George literally hates listening to women.
And I don't want to speak for her, so I'm going to play the clip where she clarifies these messages.
The only time that we had a conversation about anything that had to do with that night was obviously when the stuff with Harry happened. And he texted me asking if it seemed like anything had happened. And I, at the time, said no, because the conversation was not about George. The conversation was about him, and it was about the underage drinking, and it wasn't ever about whether or not Caiti, it was always just about him and not George.